Hey guys, in this video we are going to cover subscriptions and adding a subscription part to our GraphQL server that we've been building over the past few episodes. We've already got our schema set with a query and mutations, but subscriptions really sort of pave way for the next level within a GraphQL database, and it's really an interesting space within GraphQL at the moment. Is this idea of subscribing to queries, and when there are any updates occur, they are pushed through the subscription model, and your endpoints and GraphQL is made aware. So if you do have a query for all events and someone adds a new event, then you will get that updated event within that array, which I think is really powerful. It's built around WebSockets. It's close to being part of the GraphQL specification. They're working really hard to bring it in and across all of their implementations, but the implementation that I'm going to use today is using the Apollo server implementation, and more specifically using the GraphQL Server Express modules. So if we have a look at our project, what I have been using so far is the Express GraphQL module, and that's really a very thin layer for GraphQL on top of the Express framework. But as you sort of dive in and want to do more with GraphQL and subscriptions, you need to begin to think about using something that has a lot more within it. This is possible of using subscriptions, but the graphical interface doesn't support subscriptions. So instead of hacking together some workflow for this, it could be beneficial to show you how you would go about creating a GraphQL server on top of Express, but using the Apollo version instead. Apollo create a really cool client version for React. It's kind of an alternate version to using Relay Modern, if you've heard of those. It's kind of what you put in your React side to query this database, but they also have a server implementation as well, which is really awesome. So let's dive in and create that. First of all, I'm just going to remove the Express GraphQL module, and then we'll be able to run our application and sort of see when things sort of work and don't work by doing that. Then we'll just do yarn add, I believe it is GraphQL Server Express. We'll also, while we're at it, install GraphQL subscriptions and GraphQL, we'll install subscriptions transport web sockets. I think that's the three libraries that we'll use. So while that's installing that, we're just going to open up the index file for our server. Now we no longer have this, of course. What we will do is just bring in the HTTP module, the create server export from our HTTP library, and that's built in to Node. There is one other library that we'll need to include, and that is the body parser. And that allows us to just use the body parser within the GraphQL endpoint to accept JSON within our requests and responses. So we'll set that up now, body parser, and we'll just use yarn add body parser. So that will install that. This line here, though, what we'll need to do is install GraphQL Express and Graphical Express as well. And that is coming from the package we just installed, which was GraphQL Server Express. GraphQL Server Express, awesome. So that's linked up there. We're importing our schema as normal. Instead of calling this server here, I'm going to rename this to app, so pay attention to that. And this part here, I'm going to actually get rid of all of this, and we will here place app dot use body parser dot JSON function, and that just applies that middleware to our Express application to use the body parser throughout. You could just make this middleware for the GraphQL endpoint, but we will add things to this API as we go further on in the course, so we'll not panic about that. We will at some point need to add in CORS for our cross-origin resource sharing. that just means when we do eventually have a React interface for this server, we need to be able to query it, but we'll come back and edit this file to allow that later. The other thing, app use, is just to create that route again, and this is where we will place Graphical Express, and that accepts the schema for now. Excellent. Then I'm just going to create a const down here called server, and that just takes in our create server function, which we imported up here, and we're going to pipe in our application. And this is just a really handy way of creating a server for our application and avoiding that express layer. This is really handy when we have multiple servers to mount within the same sort of domain. That really sets that up there. So don't worry about that too much for now. It's not necessary. You can do it just using Express and mounting that within Express, but I like to set it up that way because it's actually really clear to do so. So we'll do that. So yeah, that's set up there. We should be able to run nodemon source and we'll see what errors we are given. Cool. This is complaining we don't have our Mongo set up because I've closed this terminal and reopened it since. But if we remember back to the first episode, we set an export for our MongoDB URI to be the URL for our Mongo, and we simply just need to export that in the console. If you're using the Heroku Homebrew plugin, then you can literally run Heroku local, and if you create a proc file, you can run nodemon within that and also create a env file, so you can store that node, that MongoDB URI inside of there, or you may wish to use a library called node-env, but it's really not important at this moment. There's not a lot of exports we need to include in our application, so don't worry about that. I'm sure that we can cover that in a later video if we need to. So excellent, we've got that set. I'll just clear the window and then we'll run nodemon source, and then great, ready on port 5000. Great, so if we pop into our browser and if we go to the GraphQL endpoint, we'll see get query missing. Now the reason for this is because unlike the Express GraphQL module, the graphical interface is actually something that we need to mount on a different path, and that's just the way that this plugin has been built to really sort of separate those concerns within there. So that is Graphical Express, and we need to include the endpoint URL, and we simply just pass in GraphQL, and that's where our endpoint goes. So as we noticed on the right hand side in our terminal, nodemon has refreshed, and if we pop over to /graphical, we should see our graphical interface run. And if we grab all the events, we should see that our GraphQL query is working fine. So this is what we have here. All our events are coming back, and there are just additional events in here that I've created, so don't worry about that if that looks different to yours if you've been following along. But we're kind of at a stage now where we've converted our Express GraphQL middleware, and we're now ready to start adding subscriptions. So I'm going to stop the server at this point, and I'm just going to commit this to Git and converted from GraphQL Express to Apollo Express server, and we'll push that to GitHub. Don't worry if you haven't created a GitHub and you are not syncing this with your repository. We can do that in a later video. It's not really important. I've just done that so you can download and check the code as you go along. But we're now at a point where we can start adding in our subscriptions. So let's get started with that. The first thing I like to do is create a file called socket.js, and it's inside of here that I like to import pubsub, and that is const pubsub, and that is from the GraphQL subscriptions module, and I like to just do a module export equals new pubsub, and that just creates a new pubsub instance socket for us, so we can acquire that in our other files for when we publish and subscribe to any updates. So cool. With that file done, that's all we really need inside of there. There's nothing more that we need to do, so that is great. Very simple and straightforward. The next thing, I am going to create a folder called subscriptions, and I'm going to create an index file. And inside of here, I will import a file for our event create subscription. So we're actually going to create a subscription that listens for new events that are created and then responds with that. So, and obviously need to create a file for this, but let's export that there, and that will be our GraphQL object type. If you've been following along, if we look at our query index, we should see that this is in the same way, and this is just a plain object, and the same with our mutations. And what happens here is in our schema file, we actually import these, and that's what we'll do here. If we import the subscriptions folder, and obviously that's going to pull in that index file and the exports for that, we can then export this as new GraphQL object type. The name is subscriptions, and the fields are subscriptions as well. That is singular, sorry, like mutation and query. Cool, so that is linked up there. That's pulling in our new subscriptions folder and adding it to our GraphQL schema. So that's all we need to do in our schema file. Obviously, we need to create this file that this is importing, so we will do that now. Event creator.js, and this is where we will create something to subscribe to our events that are created. And we do that by importing the pub sub, or we can just call it socket from that socket file, and that's back up a directory, and then we can import the actual event type. We're going to need that as well. So that is back up a directory, and that is inside event. Cool, so module exports. And now what we need to do in this file is we actually just need to, like we have in our query, we need to return a type, and that's what we'll do here. But also, we're not submitting a resolve here. We're not going to return a resolve function. There's actually another function that we need to use, and that's called the subscribe function. And this function literally, for the moment, will just return socket dot and then async iterator. Now this async iterator is just something that we can use that listens for an event that is published using the event created constant. If you're familiar using Redux or anything like that, you'll notice that sometimes these are placed in a constants.js file, and then you would import them from there. It saves you writing event underscore created in caps across your application, and you can basically only change it in one file. Because of how simple this is, I'm not going to do that for this video, but if you extend on this or you want to do that, then please by all means do that. That's it for that file. So with that created, all this is doing is this is subscribing on our socket for anything that emits event created. If you used a WebSocket server before, a PubSub server, you publish events and you subscribe to events. You're listening for that change, that update, that message that's pushed. That's generally how chat applications work. If you built anything like that, or a cross-browser to-do list where you add it in this browser and update in this browser, the same as a chat would. This is all we're doing here. It uses that same technology. So subscriptions really are, at the moment, just built around WebSockets, which is really, really cool and really awesome. And it means a lot of people that are familiar with that can really come on board and understand the GraphQL subscriptions a lot easier. Brilliant. That's our subscribe setup, and the event created is exported, and we now have our query. Now, inside of our mutation, inside of the create event mutation, we actually now need to import that socket in here as well. And we'll go back and get that from there. And it is here where we will create, in here, we will update this function. instead of just resolving and returning the data straight away, what we actually want to do is we want to publish on that socket. So like we said earlier on, when you submit, that other subscriber can listen to that, and that's what we'll do here. So we're going to publish event created. Now this has to match up with that other constant. So you can see why people do use constants here, because you could misplace that, or you'd have to update it in 2 places if you wanted to do that. But event created, and then that's what we're listening for, and that's what we're going to return. And that is our type that we're returning, and the data is obviously the event that's brought from here. So you can see how that kind of matches up. The event creator is obviously listened in here, and when it is subscribing and returns something, it's of that event type, and that is what is here. This data is an event. That's what we get back from that. So that's how those link up. So hopefully that's clear. If it's not, reach out in the comments, reach out on Twitter. I'm at NoTrab, and we can go over that, discuss that. That's totally fine. So now we've pretty much got our schema set up, that all we need to do now is tell our server how to listen to our subscriptions endpoint and start emitting these. Pretty sure that's everything that we need to do. So we'll open up our server file, and now inside of here we need to obviously tell Graphical the subscriptions endpoint, and this is where we will place WS for WebSockets localhost, and I'm using a template literal here to grab that port from earlier. Yes, we'll use that, subscriptions, and we're going to create a new URL for that, which is subscriptions as well. One other thing which we need to import actually is 2 things actually. Subscriptions server, that's from GraphQL subscriptions, subscriptions transport WebSockets, and publish and execute, I think, from actually GraphQL itself. Let's subscribe and execute, yeah. So we subscribe and we execute, that's what we need to include there. And then with that, all we need to do actually is create a new subscription server. So down here, when we're listening for our server mounts, but we also need to run a new subscriptions server, and that subscription server singular, and inside of here we have an object which accepts our schema, execute, and the subscribe function. Now one thing I will do at this point is I will create a console log for onConnect, and basically when somebody connects to this, client connects, we can see in the terminal. We probably will see that towards the end of this video in Graphical and in the terminal. We'll see that update, and then this accepts another object argument which takes in the server. Now this can be the server that you're mounting, it's server itself, so if you want to host it on the same URL, the same path, that's where you would define that. And then we need to obviously tell it the path for our subscription server, which is just /subscriptions. That matches what we've got here. And I pretty much think that we are good to go. Instead of just typing node-mon source every time, what I like to do inside the package.json file is create a script for it. So if we create scripts and then run dev, we can then run node-mon source. Then if we need to add any additional configuration to node-mon, we can just place it in this one file, and that's very easy for us to do. Then inside the terminal, if you're using yarn, or you just run yarn dev. If you're using npm, just run npm run dev, and then hit return, and it'll boot up that server. Brilliant. It looks as though we haven't got any errors at the moment, but that may change. Let's pop over to our graphical interface, and then we should now be able to, if we check the docs over here, we should see we have a subscription, and that subscription has an event created type, which is obviously of an event type. So we should be able to run subscription event created, and whenever an event is created, we want to grab the name and we'll grab the ID back as well. And then if we open up our terminal, we can see that a client has connected and we hit return. You'll see your subscription data here will appear after your server publication. Great, so what we'll now do is open up a new window and we'll just place this below for the moment. And we're going to run a mutation, create event, pass in our data, we'll give it a name of subscriptions really are cool. And then we'll return back the name and the ID, and we'll double check that those match up. So as soon as we insert this, what we should see over here is that event. And just like that, this graphical interface was waiting for that subscription. We can see the ID here and the name really match up. So, and we also seen that that client connected as well inside of here. So it looks as though everything's up and running. Everything is working with our subscription server. This is how you would implement it on the GraphQL side. You may not just want to listen to new events created, you may want to listen to when an event is updated or deleted. If you have other query types, any other GraphQL types, you may want to listen for those. So if an event has comments or a user, or when there's a new ticket purchase, then that's maybe when you'd want to involve subscriptions. If there's a new attendee to the event, you may want to update that page instantly with that new attendee. Or if there's a new comment, you might want to show that in line, a bit like how the Facebook newsfeed does. Those comments and likes get updated straight away. So that's kind of all there is really to it for GraphQL subscriptions on the server side. I hope this video has been helpful. I will create another video on how you would now use the React UI to listen for these subscriptions, and we'll use the Apollo client for that. But that's all for this video. I hope this has helped a lot. Any questions, please message me on Twitter. I'm at Notrab. That's just Barton backwards if that's difficult to remember. But there's also the comment section below. Leave a comment in there if you like it. If you do, give it a thumbs up. If you don't, give it a thumbs down. I'll try and do better. But have a great day, enjoy, and most importantly, happy coding. Have a great one, guys.